In 1993, a birthday party filled a modest house with music, frosting, and careless laughter under buzzing yellow lights. Balloons hovered near the ceiling. The cake waited at the center of the kitchen table, and candles flared as voices sang in uneven rhythm. Then, sometime after clapping faded and the room loosened back into casual conversation, one person stepped away and didn't come back. At first, no one worried. A name was called playfully. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps moved through hallways. Minutes stretched longer than they should. The stereo went silent. The house stayed brightly lit, but something inside it changed. It was supposed to be one of those nights that disappeared gently into memory, the kind people recall years later with a smile that grows softer over time. A birthday in 1993 carried a different weight back then, before phones documented every second, before moments felt temporary by default. This one unfolded inside a modest home where the air smelled faintly of frosting and warm electricity, where laughter bounced off walls that had heard it 100 times before. Balloons hovered near the ceiling, some already beginning to sag, their colors muted under yellow bulbs that hummed quietly overhead. The cake sat at the center of the kitchen table, candles waiting, wax unbent, flames still imaginary. Everything felt rehearsed in the way happy rituals often do, as if the night already knew how it was meant to go. Adults clustered in familiar corners, plastic cups in their hands, voices overlapping in casual rhythms. Conversations drifted between work complaints, small-town gossip, and the weather, none of it important enough to remember later. Children moved like sparks between rooms, laughter sharp and careless, feet thudding against floors that bore the marks of years of family life. Music played from a stereo that had been turned just a little too loud, the kind of sound that made the walls vibrate, without anyone really noticing. Outside, the neighborhood remained still, streetlights glowing patiently, illuminating sidewalks that had carried generations of footsteps without ever keeping their secrets. There was comfort in how predictable it all felt. Birthdays had rules. They followed patterns. They ended with cake, presents, and sleepy goodbyes. No one arrived expecting anything else. No one felt the need to remember exact times or count how many people came and went. Doors opened and closed freely. The night breathed in and out without resistance. Even now, looking back, those who would say there was nothing strange about it at first, nothing that announced itself as dangerous, nothing that warned them that this night would refuse to stay ordinary. Yet beneath the easy noise, there were moments so small they almost vanished as they happened. A pause in conversation when someone thought they heard something outside, then dismissed it as imagination. A glance toward a hallway that seemed darker than it should have been, even with the lights on. A car parked farther down the street than usual, its engine quiet, its presence unexplained but unchallenged. These details didn't linger. They rarely do. Human memory is generous to happiness and ruthless to subtle warnings. The mind edits discomfort out of celebration, smoothing the edges so joy can proceed uninterrupted. At some point, the candles were lit. The room dimmed slightly as the flames took focus, small and bright, reflected in wide eyes. Singing filled the house, uneven and heartfelt, voices clashing but united by tradition. The birthday child leaned forward, breath held, the future still unbroken in their chest. The candles went out in a single rush of air, smoke curling upward, carrying wishes no one would ever hear. Applause followed. Someone clapped too loud. Someone laughed too long. Someone reached for a camera to preserve a moment that already felt safe enough to forget. Afterward, the night loosened. Kids drifted toward quieter games. Adults refilled drinks. Shoes piled near the door in untidy rows. Time lost its edges. No one noticed the exact moment when one person stepped away from the center of things. It didn't feel important. People leave rooms all the time. People step outside for air, for quiet, for a moment to themselves. Doors open. Doors close. Life continues. The house itself seemed to settle into that late evening rhythm where energy dips and conversation soften. Laughter became gentler, more spaced out. Music volume dropped a notch. Someone mentioned how late it was getting. Another suggested one last slice of cake. The sense of togetherness remained intact, unthreatened. If there was unease, it hid well, disguising itself as nothing more than fatigue. Outside, the street remained unchanged. Porch lights glowed steadily. Trees stood motionless, their leaves barely stirring. The world beyond the house did not announce itself as hostile. It rarely does. Darkness, after all, is not the same as danger. It simply waits. Inside, a name was called casually, without urgency. No response came back, but no one panicked. The name was called again, louder this time, playful. Someone joked that they were probably sneaking an extra gift or hiding somewhere. Smiles followed. A few people laughed. The assumption of safety held firm, reinforced by years of believing that nothing truly bad could happen here. Not on a night like this, not during a birthday. Minutes passed. The tone shifted almost imperceptibly. A glance exchanged, a shrug that lingered too long. Someone stood up, walked toward the hallway, checked a room. Nothing. Still no alarm. Denial is a quiet thing at first. It whispers reassurance even as uncertainty grows teeth. The house seemed suddenly larger, its corners more defined, its silences heavier. Music was turned off, not dramatically, just gently, as if to listen better. The absence of sound made everything else louder. Footsteps, breathing, the faint hum of electricity in the walls. A door was open again. The night air slipped inside, cool and unfamiliar. A name was called into the darkness outside, the voice half expecting an answer, half afraid of not hearing one. Still, no one said the word yet. No one allowed the thought to fully form. Because once it did, the night would never belong to them again. Once it did, this birthday would stop being a memory and become a marker, a dividing line between before and after. For a brief, fragile moment, hope still lived in the space between questions. Maybe they were nearby. Maybe they were playing a joke. Maybe everything would snap back into place with a laugh and an apology. That belief hovered in the air, desperate and delicate, refusing to collapse under its own weight. But the house knew something had changed. You could feel in the way people stood closer together, in the way eyes scanned rooms that had felt harmless minutes earlier. You could feel it in the tightening of voices, the way smiles faded without anyone consciously deciding to let them go. Time, once fluid, began to drag, each second heavier than the last. The birthday cake remained on the table, half-eaten. Candles reduced to crooked stubs. Balloons brushed softly against the ceiling, indifferent to the ship below them. The decorations didn't know. They had outlived their purpose. They didn't know that the night had already slipped off its intended path. And somewhere between the last laugh and the first real fear, between celebration and silence, the ordinary ended, not with a scream, not with a crash, but with a question that would echo for decades, unanswered, changing everything it touched. The night had arrived gently. It did not leave the same way. The first thing that changed was the sound. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. The house would have been alive with overlapping voices and careless laughter, seemed to exhale and then hesitate, as if unsure whether it was allowed to be loud anymore. Someone turned the music down, not because they were afraid, but because they wanted to hear better. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt crowded, pressing in from all sides, filled with the expectation that a voice would answer back at any moment. At first, the missing presence was treated like an inconvenience rather than a threat. Someone joked that they were probably hiding, that kids always did this during parties, stretching the attention just a little longer. Another person laughed too quickly, the sound thin and forced, as if trying to convince themselves more than anyone else. A door was opened, then closed again. Footsteps moved down the hallway, then returned. Still nothing. The air shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if the room itself had registered the change before anyone dared to speak it out loud. Minutes began to stretch in strange ways. People checked their watches without really understanding why. Time, which had flowed unnoticed earlier, now seemed to drag its heels. Every second felt visible, heavy, deliberate. Conversations restarted and stopped again almost immediately, as if no one could remember what they had been talking about. The night no longer knew how to behave, and neither did the people inside it. Someone stepped outside, calling the name again, louder this time. The voice carried into the darkness, met only by the distant hum of insects and the soft glow of streetlights. The neighborhood responded with nothing. No footsteps, no laughter, no movement. The street looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, and that sameness felt wrong, almost mocking. How could everything look so normal when something clearly wasn't? Back inside, a few adults exchanged glances that lasted just a second too long. They were careful not to let their faces change completely, careful not to alarm the children who were still clustered together, sensing tension but not understanding it. One person suggested checking the backyard again. Another mentioned the bathroom. Another shrugged and said maybe they walked to a friend's house nearby. The explanations came easily at first, lining up neatly, each one more hopeful than the last. But hope has a fragile structure. It depends on time behaving the way we expect it to. And time was no longer cooperating. The search inside the house became more deliberate. Doors were opened wider. Closets checked. The tone of voices shifted from playful to firm. The name was called again and again, each time losing a bit of its warmth. The walls, once comforting, now seemed to echo back questions instead of answers. Every empty room felt accusatory, as if it were withholding something it knew. A child asked where they were. An adult answered too quickly, too confidently, promising everything was fine. The words felt rehearsed, even to the person saying them. Beneath the surface, panic stirred, slow and thick, not yet visible but impossible to ignore. Panic doesn't always arrive with chaos. Sometimes it seeps in quietly, filling cracks one at a time. Outside, more people gathered. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, drawn by raised voices and repeated calls. Someone walked down the street, scanning shadows, peering behind parked cars. The unfamiliar vehicle from earlier was noticed again, but only as a passing thought, easily dismissed. In moments like this, the mind clings to patterns it understands, even when the situation demands suspicion. The night air felt colder now, sharper against skin. The stars overhead offered no guidance. Streetlights cast long shadows that twisted and stretched, turning ordinary objects into fleeting threats. Every movement caught the eye. Every sound caused heads to turn. The world had become a place where anything might mean something, and nothing could be trusted to stay insignificant. Inside the house, the birthday decorations began to feel out of place, almost cruel. Streamers drooped from door frames like forgotten promises. The cake, once the center of attention, sat untouched now, its sweetness suddenly inappropriate. No one thought to clear it away. No one wanted to disturb the last physical proof that the night had once been joyful. Another suggestion surfaced. Quieter this time. Maybe they should call someone. Maybe it was time to ask for help. The idea hung in the air, heavy with implication. Making that call would mean admitting what everyone was trying not to say. It would mean acknowledging that this wasn't just a delay or a misunderstanding. It would mean crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. Voices lowered. Words were chosen carefully. One person paced. Another stood still, hands clasped tightly together, as if holding on to the last thread of control. The children were ushered into one room, told to stay together, to wait. They obeyed, wide-eyed, absorbing the fear without fully understanding it. This was how innocence learned its first hard lesson, by watching adults struggle to hide their own terror. When the call was finally made, it didn't feel dramatic. There was no screaming, no collapse. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, asking questions that felt too formal for the moment. Names, ages, last known locations. Each answer seemed to pull the situation further away from normal life and closer to something unrecognizable. As the call ended, the house fell into a deeper silence. The kind that settles after a decision has been made, when there is no longer any pretending left to do. The night had crossed its threshold. The birthday was officially over, even though the clock said otherwise. Outside, flashing lights approached, red and blue slicing through the darkness. They reflected off windows and cars, casting the neighborhood in unnatural colors. The arrival authorities brought a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that someone else was now responsible. Dread that their presence confirmed the worst fear. This was no longer just a missing person inside a house. This was something larger, something that would not be solved with quick search and an apology. People answered questions in fragmented sentences. Memories blurred. Times were guessed at. Everyone wanted to be helpful, but fear distorted details. The night refused to present itself clearly, as if already determined to protect its secrets. Officers moved through the house, noting things that had never seemed important before. An open door, a light left on, a window that might have been unlocked earlier. The children were sent home, their parents holding them tighter than usual, whispering reassurances they didn't fully believe. The street emptied slowly, leaving behind an uneasy stillness. What had been a gathering place hours earlier now felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped of its warmth. Inside, the family remained, suspended in a state that felt like waiting but was actually something else entirely. Waiting implies an end. This felt endless. Every sound outside caused hearts to race. Every passing car sparked a brief surge of hope, followed by crushing disappointment. The night seemed to stretch infinitely, refusing to move forward, refusing to release its grip. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked, each second a reminder that time was still passing, even if life had stopped making sense. The music never came back on. The light stayed too bright. The house no longer felt like a home. It had become a place where something had been taken, and no one yet understood how, or why, or by whom. The birthday had not ended with laughter or tired smiles. It ended with questions that echoed into the early hours of morning, questions that would grow heavier with each passing day. And as the night wore on, one truth settled in quietly, undeniable and terrifying. Whatever had happened, it was not something that would resolve itself by morning. By the time the word missing began to circulate, it no longer sounded hypothetical. It carried weight now, dense and immovable, settling into every corner of the house and every mind inside it. The early optimism that something simple would explain the absence dissolved under the pressure of repetition. Names had been called too many times. Rooms had been checked too thoroughly. The night had offered enough silence to make its answer clear. Law enforcement moved with a kind of practiced calm that felt almost offensive in contrast to the panic simmering beneath the surface. Not because they didn't care, but because urgency, to them, had rules. They asked questions slowly, deliberately, as if the right phrasing could force clarity out of confusion. When was the last time anyone saw them? Who was with them? What were they wearing? Each question landed like a small cut, reopening the same wound from a different angle. People answered as best they could, but memory had already begun to betray them. Times blurred together. One person was certain it had been just after the candles were blown out. Another insisted it was later, closer to when the music stopped. Someone else wasn't sure at all. The night resisted reconstruction. It slipped through fingers no matter how tightly they tried to hold on to it. Officers moved room to room, observing what had once been invisible. The house, so familiar earlier, now felt like a crime scene without a crime, its normalcy suddenly suspicious. A door that might have been left ajar. A window that no one remembered locking. Shoes near the entrance that couldn't be accounted for. Nothing screamed danger, but everything whispered possibility. Outside, the search expanded. Flashlights cut through yards and alleyways, beams dancing across fences, bushes, and patches of grass that had never mattered before. Neighbors stood in small clusters, arms crossed, shoulders hunched against the night air, watching strangers comb through their quiet streets. Familiar landmarks transformed under scrutiny. The corner where kids rode bikes, the path behind the houses, the small wooded area no one had thought twice about in years. Each place was called out loud, named, checked, and cleared, and each time it came up empty. The weight in everyone's chest grew heavier. Absence has a way of multiplying. The longer it persists, the larger it feels. Questions began to take on sharper edges. Had anyone noticed someone unfamiliar earlier in the evening? Had there been an argument? Had the missing person seemed upset, distracted, eager to leave? People searched their memories desperately, replaying moments that had felt insignificant at the time. A glance, a tone of voice, a decision to step outside. Every detail was re-examined, turned over, then turned over again, hoping something hidden would finally reveal itself. But the truth was simple and terrifying. There were no clear signs of struggle, no screams reported, no broken objects, no blood, nothing that fit neatly into the stories people told themselves about how disappearances were supposed to happen. The lack of evidence didn't feel reassuring. It felt wrong. The absence of chaos made everything more unsettling. It suggested planning, or opportunity, or something so quiet it had slipped past everyone without resistance. The mind recoiled from that thought, but it lingered anyway, unwelcome and persistent. As hours passed, the crowd thinned. Some neighbors were told to go home. Others lingered, unwilling to leave the space where hope still flickered. The family remained at the center of it all, answering the same questions again and again, their voices growing hoarse, their faces tightening with exhaustion and fear. They weren't grieving yet. They were suspended in something worse, uncertainty. A report was filed. Words were written down, formal and permanent. Names entered into systems. Descriptions logged. The missing person was no longer just missing. They were now a case, a file, a problem to be solved. The transformation felt cold, but it was necessary. Procedures existed for a reason. Still, something about seeing the night reduced to paperwork felt deeply wrong. Search efforts continued through the early hours, methodical and relentless. Dogs were brought in, noses to the ground, tracing paths that might or might not mean anything. Officers followed faint leads that dissolved within minutes. A scent lost, a trail interrupted. Each dead and chipped away at morale, even as no one dared to say it out loud. Dawn crept in slowly, its light unwelcome. Morning was supposed to bring clarity, a sense of reset. Instead, it exposed how much time had passed with nothing to show for it. The street looked painfully normal in daylight. Cars parked neatly, lawns undisturbed. The house stood quietly, blinds drawn, its windows reflecting a sky that seemed indifferent to what had happened below. With daylight came the realization that this was not a short-term emergency. This was something that might stretch on, something that could outlast shock and adrenaline. Volunteers began to arrive, some invited, others drawn by word of mouth. Flyers were hastily made, names and faces printed in bold, hopeful fonts, phone numbers listed beneath, waiting for calls that might never come. The missing person's image stared back at everyone now, frozen in a moment before everything went wrong. It felt surreal, seeing them reduced to paper and ink when they had been so present just hours earlier. The contrast was unbearable. Investigators began constructing timelines, marking events on charts, trying to force order onto chaos. But timelines depend on certainty, and certainty was in short supply. The night resisted being pinned down. It shifted and blurred, refusing to align itself neatly. Speculation crept in quietly, despite efforts to keep it at bay. People wondered if it had been someone they knew, someone they trusted, or a stranger passing through. Each possibility carried its own horror. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal easily. Suspicion spread like a stain, subtle but irreversible. The family clung to routine in small ways, as if structure could anchor them. By the second night, sleep had become an abstract idea, something people talk about but no longer expected. The town moved differently now, as if every street and every building had adjusted its posture in response to what had happened. Doors that were once left unlocked were checked twice. Porch lights stayed on long after midnight. Curtains shifted as people watched the street instead of the television. The disappearance had spread beyond the walls of one house and settled into the collective consciousness, heavy and undeniable. Search efforts grew larger, louder, more visible. Volunteers gathered in parking lots and school fields, clutching flashlights, maps, and thermoses filled with coffee that grew cold before it was finished. They came from nearby streets, nearby towns, and places farther away than anyone expected. Some knew the family. Some only knew the story. Others came because the idea of not helping felt unbearable. There was a strange unity in the air, a sense that this was no longer just about one person, but about proving that the town could protect its own. Flyers appeared everywhere. On telephone poles, storefront windows, bulletin boards. The same face stared out from every corner, smiling, unaware of what the image had come to represent. People stopped to read the details. even when they already knew them by heart. Height, clothing, last known location. Each word carried hope, the implication that someone, somewhere, might recognize something and make the call that would change everything. The searches moved outward in widening circles. Fields were combed. Trails were walked again and again, footprints blurring into one another until they meant nothing. Creeks were checked, their water shallow and clear, offering no answers. The woods, once a place for shortcuts and childhood adventures, took on a new personality under the beam of flashlights. Shadows thickened. Sounds felt amplified. Every snapped twig caused heads to turn, hearts to race, hope to surge and collapse in the same breath. Rumors began to circulate, slipping between conversations like smoke. Someone thought they saw a figure walking near the highway late at night. Someone else heard a scream, or thought they did, but couldn't say when. A car description changed shape with each retelling, its color shifting, its direction uncertain. People repeated these stories not to deceive, but because fear craves narrative. When answers are absent, the mind fills the gaps however it can. Law enforcement tried to keep the focus on facts, but facts were scarce. Tips flooded in anyway. Every phone call was logged. Every lead followed, at least at first. Officers drove miles to check out sightings that dissolved under scrutiny. Each false alarm chipped away at momentum, but no one dared dismiss anything too quickly. The cost of being wrong felt too high. At night, vigils formed. Candles flickered in the dark, small flames trembling in the breeze. People stood shoulder to shoulder, silent or whispering prayers, their faces illuminated by light that felt fragile and defiant at the same time. The gatherings were meant to bring comfort, but they also served as a reminder of how long it had been since anyone had seen the missing person. Each candle represented both hope and the growing fear that hope alone might not be enough. The family at the center of it all existed in a separate reality. Their days blurred into nights, marked only by phone calls, brief updates, and long stretches of waiting. Food arrived at the house, untouched or barely eaten. Friends came and went, offering words that felt inadequate the moment they were spoken. Every knock on the door sent a jolt through the house. Every ring of the phone triggered a split second of breathless anticipation, followed by either relief or disappointment. The town watched them closely, not out of curiosity, but because they represented something everyone feared becoming. Parents held their children tighter, suddenly aware of how thin the line between safety and catastrophe could be. Ordinary routines felt reckless now. Kids were walked to school instead of sent alone. Playdates were supervised. Freedom narrowed quietly and permanently. As days passed without answers, the mood shifted. The initial surge of energy gave way to exhaustion. Volunteers still showed up, but in smaller numbers. Searches were shorter, more targeted. The unspoken question lingered. How long could this go on? No one wanted to be the first to stop looking, but fatigue is relentless. Hope requires energy, and energy was fading. Suspicion began to creep into places it didn't belong. Neighbors who had known each other for years found themselves reassessing old interactions. Offhand comments were replayed with new emphasis. Innocent behaviors took on darker interpretations. Trust eroded not because people wanted it to, but because fear demands explanations, and when none exist, it creates its own. The media arrived, bringing cameras and microphones, their presence both validating and invasive. The story spread beyond town limits, beyond state lines. The disappearance became a headline, then a talking point, then a segment between commercials. For some, that attention felt like a lifeline. For others, it felt like the story was being taken away from them, turned into something unrecognizable. Still, the town could not sleep. Nights were the worst. Darkness amplified every fear, every unanswered question. People lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds, replaying the timeline in their heads, wondering what they might have missed. Regret settled in, heavy and unproductive. If only someone had noticed sooner. If only someone had walked outside at the right moment. If only the night had unfolded differently. The landscape itself seemed to change under the weight of it all. Familiar streets felt hostile. Empty lots felt ominous. The town had not physically changed, but perception had. Safety, once assumed, now felt conditional, fragile, easily revoked. And yet, beneath the fear and exhaustion, a stubborn determination remained. People refused to let the disappearance fade into background noise. They spoke the name often, keeping it alive in conversations, in prayers, in the way they looked at one another with shared understanding. This was their way of resisting the silence that threatened to swallow the story whole. But silence is patience. As days turned into weeks, the absence began to settle into town like a fog that never fully lifted. Life resumed in fragments. Schools reopened. Businesses returned to regular hours. Smiles appeared again, cautious and subdued. But the disappearance remained, an invisible presence woven into everyday life. The town did not forget. It couldn't, but it learned how to exist alongside the unanswered question, how to carry it quietly without letting it crush everything else. At least, that's what it told itself. In the quiet moments, when the streets emptied and lights dimmed, the truth surfaced again, raw and unfiltered. Someone was gone, and no amount of searching, praying, or hoping had been enough to bring them back. The town that once slept soundly now rested with one eye open, haunted by the knowledge that something had slipped through their collective grasp, and that it might never be recovered. The shift was subtle at first, almost polite. The urgency that had once driven every conversation and every movement didn't disappear overnight. It simply began to thin, stretched across days that ended without answers. Investigators were still present, still asking questions, still making calls, but the tone had changed. There was less running, more waiting, less noise, more paperwork. The case was no longer new. In the world of investigations, time has a way of quietly rearranging priorities. Leads continued to come in, but they arrived tangled and unreliable. A sighting reported one day would unravel the next. Someone swore they recognized a face on a flyer in a passing car, only to later admit they weren't sure. Tips overlapped, contradicted each other, or led to places already searched. Each call raised hope just long enough for disappointment to sharpen its edge. Investigators followed protocol, chasing each possibility as far as it would go, even when experience suggested where it would end. Files grew thicker. Notes accumulated. Evidence bags sat sealed, holding items that might mean something someday or might mean nothing at all. The absence of a clear suspect kept the investigation in motion, but also trapped it in a loop. Without a direction, every path looked equally plausible and equally unpromising. The case existed everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The family learned a new language during this period, one made up of careful phrasing and controlled optimism. Phrases like "no significant updates" and "we're still following all leads" became part of their daily reality. Each update felt incomplete, as if something essential had been left unsaid. They listened closely to tone rather than words, searching for hidden meaning, for any hint that progress was being made. Days turned into weeks, and the search radius expanded and contracted without yielding anything concrete. Ground searches slowed. Volunteers were thanked and released. Dogs were called off. The physical act of looking gradually gave way to the quieter work of reviewing, cross-referencing, and waiting. The disappearance no longer felt active. It felt suspended, caught between effort and acceptance. Investigators revisited the same locations, not because they expected different results, but because there was nowhere else to go. The house was examined again. The street was walked again. The timeline was reconstructed again, with the same gaps and contradictions. Every revisit carried the same frustration, the same sinking realization that the answers were not hiding in obvious places. Behind closed doors, difficult conversations took place. Resources were limited. Other cases demanded attention. The world did not pause for one disappearance, no matter how devastating it felt to those living inside it. Decisions were made carefully, framed as strategic rather than emotional. The investigation remained open, but its intensity dimmed, like a light turned down rather than switched off. For the family, this shift was impossible to ignore. Fewer calls came in. Fewer people stopped by the house. Media interest waned, cameras turning toward newer, louder stories. The silence felt heavier than the noise ever had. It forced them to confront a reality they had been avoiding, the possibility that this might not end neatly or quickly or at all. They lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn because there was no confirmation of loss, unable to hope freely because hope now came with a cost. Every milestone passed awkwardly. Birthdays felt wrong. Holidays felt hollow. Time moved forward despite their resistance, leaving them behind in a moment that refused to resolve. Investigators continued to check in, but the visits felt different now. They were less frequent, more formal. Updates came in batches rather than in real time. The case had entered a phase defined by patience, a word that sounded cruel under the circumstances. Patient implied waiting without guarantees, trusting a process that offered no timeline. Rumors continued to circulate, but without the energy they once carried. Speculation faded into background noise. People grew tired of guessing. The town, which had once lived and breathed the search, began to redirect its focus. Life demanded attention. Bills needed paying. Children needed raising. Normalcy crept back in, unwelcome but unavoidable. The case file remained, its presence both comforting and infuriating. It represented effort, care, and the promise that the disappearance had not been forgotten. But it also represented stagnation, a story frozen in time. Each new detective who reviewed it brought fresh eyes and fresh frustration, quickly learning that the absence of evidence was not an oversight, but the defining feature of the case. Years passed quietly. The disappearance became a reference point rather than an active event. Remember when replaced what if? The story was told in past tense, even though nothing had officially ended. New residents moved in, unfamiliar with the details, learning about it only through whispers and local lore. For the family, the passage of time felt like a betrayal. Every year that went by without answers deepened the wound rather than healing it. They marked time not by calendars, but by how long it had been since they last heard the voice they were waiting for. Memories grew fragile, edges blurring, details fading. The fear of forgetting became almost as painful as the fear of never knowing. Occasionally, something would stir. A call from an investigator. A renewed search prompted by a tip. A brief resurgence of media interest. Each time, hope flared again, cautious but alive. And each time, it faded just as quickly, leaving behind a deeper exhaustion. The investigation never officially closed. It remained open in name, active in theory. But in practice, it drifted into a quiet corner of institutional memory, revisited periodically, dusted off, then set aside once more. The case had gone cold, not because anyone stopped caring, but because it stopped offering anything in return. Cold cases are defined by absence, not just of evidence, but of momentum, of urgency, a belief that tomorrow will bring something new. They exist in a strange limbo, neither solved nor abandoned. This one settled there, heavy and unresolved, a permanent question mark etched into the town's history. And as the years stretched on, the truth became increasingly difficult to face. The night of the birthday was no longer a recent wound. It was a scar, old and sensitive, aching whenever it was touched. The investigation had done everything it knew how to do, and it had reached the edge of its reach. What remained was silence, waiting, and a file that held a story no one had been able to finish telling. Time did not heal the absence. It learned to live beside it. The years moved forward in visible, undeniable ways, even as the story remained frozen at the same unfinished sentence. Children grew taller. Faces changed. Houses were repainted. Seasons passed in their familiar cycles. And yet, for the people closest to the disappearance, time felt dishonest, as if it were advancing without permission, leaving something vital behind. The family discovered quickly that grief without an ending behaves differently. There was no funeral to mark the loss, no grave to visit, no finality to anchor their pain. Instead, there was waiting. Waiting became a lifestyle, a habit, a constant low hum beneath everything else. Phones were never fully silenced. Doors were never fully closed. Every unknown number carried the weight of possibility. Every knock held the potential to collapse the fragile balance they had learned to maintain. Birthdays became complicated rituals. The missing chair at the table was never officially acknowledged, but it was always felt. Cards were still bought, gifts sometimes wrapped and set aside, then quietly put away again. Celebrations happened, but they were restrained, cautious, as if joy itself needed permission. To be too happy felt like a betrayal. To be too sad felt like surrender. Holidays carried a similar tension. Traditions continued because stopping them felt like another kind of loss. Photos were taken, but always framed carefully, as if leaving space for someone who might one day return. Stories were told and retold, each time subtly altered by memory's erosion. The past became both refuge and burden, a place revisited often but never safely. The parents aged under the weight of unanswered questions. Their faces changed in ways that went beyond the normal passage of time. Worry etched itself into their expressions, permanent and unyielding. They learned to answer the same question from strangers again and again, offering summaries of their lives, as if they were case studies rather than people. How long had it been? Were there any updates? Did they still believe? Belief became a complicated thing. It shifted, evolved, fractured. Some days, hope felt solid and real, grounded in conviction that the truth could not stay hidden forever. Other days, it felt foolish, a defense mechanism against despair. They learned to live between these extremes, carrying both without letting either one win completely. Siblings grew up in the shadow of the disappearance. Their childhoods were shaped by caution, by watchfulness, by an unspoken understanding that safety was fragile. They learned early that the world could change without warning. Milestones were achieved with pride and guilt intertwined, as if moving forward meant leaving someone behind. They became adults with an awareness most people never develop, one born not of wisdom, but of loss. The town remembered, though its memory softened over time. New families moved in, unaware of the details, learning the story only through fragments. The disappearance became part of local identity, referenced quietly, respectfully, often with a shake of the head. That was before your time, people would say, and the phrase carried more weight than it seemed. Occasionally, the case resurfaced publicly. An anniversary article, a brief news segment, a mention in a list of unresolved mysteries. Each appearance reopened wounds, reminding everyone how little had changed. The family watched these moments carefully, scanning for new information, even when experience suggested there would be none. The disappointment never got easier. Technology advanced in the background, reshaping the world in ways no one in 1993 could have predicted. DNA databases expanded. Surveillance became common. Records once stored in filing cabinets moved into digital systems. The family followed these changes closely, aware that progress elsewhere did not guarantee progress for them. Still, they clung to the idea that time might eventually work in their favor, that something once impossible could become routine. The absence seeped into their sense of self. They were no longer just parents, siblings, relatives. They were people defined by what they were missing. Introductions became awkward. Conversations stalled. People didn't know what to say, and often chose to say nothing at all. Silence became a familiar companion, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating. Memories began to blur at the edges. Details once sharp softened with repetition. The sound of a laugh, the exact shade of a smile, the way a voice filled a room. These things grew harder to recall with certainty, and that loss felt almost as painful as the original disappearance. Forgetting felt like another form of erasure, one that happened slowly and quietly, without anyone noticing until it was already underway. Yet, the memory refused to disappear completely. It lingered in small, unexpected ways. A song on the radio, a familiar phrase spoken by a stranger, a face glimpsed in a crowd that looked just close enough to cause a momentary jolt of recognition. These moments were both cruel and sustaining, reminders that the bond had not been broken, even if everything else had. For years, the story had existed in a fixed shape, a birthday, a disappearance, an absence that refused to explain itself. Everyone who touched the case learned that shape by heart, memorized its angles, its gaps, its familiar dead ends. The details had been reviewed so many times they felt exhausted, flattened by repetition. Nothing new was supposed to emerge from them. Nothing old was supposed to matter anymore. And yet, it was something old that finally stirred. It began quietly, the way most turning points do, not with a revelation, but with a question that fell out of place. A routine review, a box pulled from storage, a file opened more out of obligation then expectation. The case had been revisited before, countless times, always with the same result. But this time, someone lingered where others had skimmed. Someone paused where others had moved on. The detail itself was small, so small that it had survived decades without drawing attention. It existed in the margins of reports, in a line written once and never emphasized again. At the time, it had seemed unimportant, easily explained, not worth delaying an investigation that had far bigger questions to answer. In the chaos of those early days, it had blended into the noise. Back then, everyone had been looking for something dramatic, a scream, a witness, a struggle, the obvious signs that something terrible had happened. This detail offered none of that. It was ordinary, mundane, the kind of thing that happens every day without consequence. So it was acknowledged and then forgotten, left behind as the search surged forward without it. Decades later, it looked different. The person reviewing the case noticed how often that detail brushed against key moments in the timeline without ever being addressed directly. It appeared just before the disappearance. It surfaced again in a witness statement. It hovered near the edge of an early lead that had gone nowhere. Not enough to raise alarms on its own, but enough to suggest a pattern. When viewed through the lens of hindsight, patterns are easier to see when time has stripped away distractions. With the urgency long gone, the case could finally be examined without the pressure to act immediately. There was room now for slow thinking, for uncomfortable questions, for revisiting assumptions that had hardened into facts simply because they had gone unchallenged for so long. What if that detail hadn't been meaningless? What if it hadn't been coincidence? What if it had been misinterpreted rather than irrelevant? As the thread was pulled, gently at first, it began to loosen other things around it. Statements that had once seemed consistent now felt incomplete. Timelines that had been accepted without debate developed small but significant fractures. The story everyone thought they knew began to wobble, not collapsing, but shifting just enough to cause unease. The realization wasn't immediate. It crept in slowly, resisted at every step by the mind's instinct to preserve what it already understands. Admitting that something obvious had been overlooked felt like an accusation, not just against investigators, but against everyone who had lived with the story for so long. The idea that the truth had been nearby all along was almost harder to accept than the idea that it was gone forever. Re-examination brought discomfort. It forced old questions back into the present, questions people had learned to stop asking. Why had that moment been dismissed so quickly? Why had no one followed up more thoroughly? Why had the explanation offered at the time been accepted without challenge? None of these questions came with easy answers. The early investigation had been overwhelmed, under pressure, working with limited tools and incomplete information. Mistakes made then were not born of neglect, but of human limitation. Still, acknowledging that did little to soften the impact of what was now becoming clear. The detail suggested proximity. It suggested timing. It suggested that someone had been closer to the truth than anyone realized, standing near it without recognizing its shape. It reframed the disappearance not as something that came out of nowhere, but as something that slipped through a narrow window of opportunity, unnoticed because everyone was looking elsewhere. As this realization took hold, it cast the past in a harsher light. Memories of the search felt different now, heavier. The routes walked, the questions asked, the doors knocked on. How many times had people passed over the same ground without realizing what they were missing? How many chances had there been to see the night more clearly? For the family, learning about this shift reopened wounds they had spent years carefully managing. The idea that the case might have unfolded differently if that detail had been understood sooner was unbearable. It introduced a new kind of grief, one rooted not just in loss, but in possibility. The possibility that the outcome might have changed. The possibility that the waiting might not have lasted so long. At the same time, it reignited something they had learned to keep buried. Hope, cautious and fragile, stirred again. Not the naive hope of the early days, but something sharper, more focused. If the detail mattered now, maybe it had always mattered. And if it had always mattered, then maybe the story was not as closed as it had seemed. Investigators approached this reopening carefully. They knew how dangerous it was to overcorrect, to assign meaning where there might be none. But they also knew that dismissing it again would mean repeating the same mistake twice. The balance between skepticism and curiosity became delicate, each step measured. As the detail was traced backward and forward through the case, it began to touch other overlooked fragments. A report that had never been followed up, a name that appeared briefly and then vanished from the record, a timeline discrepancy that had once been blamed on faulty memory. Each connection strengthened the sense that something essential had been hiding in plain sight. The story began to change shape, subtly but unmistakably. It was no longer just about what happened after the disappearance. By the time the year shifted to 2024, the world no longer resembled the one that had existed when the case was first opened. Technology had rewritten the rules of investigation in ways that once would have sounded like science fiction. Patterns could be found in oceans of data. Connections could be drawn across decades in seconds. What had once depended on memory, intuition, and handwritten notes now lived inside systems designed to see what humans could not. This was the quiet reason the case surfaced again. It wasn't because of public pressure or media attention or a sudden confession. It was because the past had finally become searchable in a way it never had before. Old evidence could now be examined alongside new information, layered, compared, and tested against patterns far beyond the scope of the original investigation. What once sat dormant in boxes now had the potential to speak. The FBI's involvement didn't arrive with fanfare. There were no press conferences, no dramatic announcements. It began as an internal review, prompted by the resurfaced detail that refused to stay buried. That detail, now seen as potentially significant, fit into a category of cases the Bureau had become increasingly interested in, long-term disappearances where early assumptions may have closed doors too soon. Cold cases are not revisited lightly. Each one carries emotional weight, political implications, and the risk of reopening wounds without delivering answers. But this case had something many others didn't. It had gaps that technology could now address. And it had just enough unresolved tension to suggest that those gaps mattered. Federal analysts began by doing what they do best. Stepping back, they didn't start with theories. They started with data. Every report, every statement, every log from 1993 was digitized, standardized, and fed into systems designed to notice inconsistencies humans often overlook. Timelines were rebuilt with ruthless precision. Overlapping accounts were compared not for similarity, but for divergence. Small discrepancies surfaced almost immediately, not dramatic contradictions, but subtle misalignments. A time recorded 2 minutes differently in separate reports. A location described vaguely when it should have been specific. A name mentioned without follow-up. Individually, these things meant nothing. Collectively, they suggested friction. And friction, to investigators, often signals truth pushing against an incomplete story. The FBI didn't assume wrongdoing by local authorities. In fact, their approach acknowledged the constraints of the early investigation. In 1993, information moved slowly. Databases were fragmented. Communication between agencies relied heavily on phone calls and paperwork. Leads could be lost simply because there was no efficient way to connect them. What had once been reasonable limitations now looked like opportunities for reevaluation. One of the most significant shifts came from how behavior was analyzed. In the early 90s, profiling was narrower, more reliant on patterns already known. In 2024, behavioral analysis had evolved into something far more nuanced. It considered not just what people did, but what they didn't do. Silence, timing, proximity, and coincidence were treated as data points rather than background noise. That overlooked detail from the past was re-examined through this lens. It wasn't isolated anymore. It was contextualized. Analysts asked different questions now. Not just why it happened, but why it happened when it did. Not just who noticed it, but who didn't. The answers began to form a shape that felt disturbingly intentional. DNA technology played a role as well, though not in the way people often imagine. There was no sudden match, no instant identification. Instead, the power lay in exclusion. Samples once considered inconclusive were now tested with far greater sensitivity. Databases had expanded exponentially. allowing investigators to rule out possibilities that had lingered unresolved for decades. Each exclusion narrowed the field, tightening the focus. Digital forensics extended beyond physical evidence. Records that once required manual retrieval were now searchable across systems. Old employment logs, vehicle registrations, travel records, and archived communications were cross-referenced automatically. The FBI could trace movements and associations with a level of clarity that would have been impossible in the 90s. What emerged wasn't a single revelation, but a convergence. Several independent threads, previously unconnected, began pointing in the same direction. The resurfaced detail aligned with a behavioral anomaly. That anomaly intersected with a timeline inconsistency. That inconsistency overlapped with a record that hadn't existed in searchable form during the original investigation. Each piece reinforced the others, creating a framework that felt both new and inevitable. For the family, the renewed involvement was met with cautious restraint. They had been here before. Promises had been made. Renewed efforts had fizzled out. Hope had burned them enough times that they treated it now like a fragile object, handled carefully, never fully embraced. Still, the difference was impossible to ignore. The questions being asked were different. The language was different. The silence between updates felt purposeful rather than empty. The FBI didn't rush. They understood the danger of moving too quickly after years of stillness. Every step was deliberate, documented, designed to withstand scrutiny. This wasn't just about finding answers. It was about ensuring that whatever emerged could not be dismissed or undone. Quietly, people were recontacted. Conversations took place without cameras or headlines. Memories were revisited, not with accusation, but with precision. Witnesses who had once been peripheral were now central. Statements given decades earlier were compared to current recollections, not to catch inconsistencies, but to understand how perception had shifted over time. Some people were cooperative. Others were uncomfortable. Time had a way of hardening certain truths and softening others. The discovery did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in stages, each layer forcing a pause, each realization demanding silence before it could be absorbed. Those closest to the investigation would later say it wasn't a single moment of shock, but a slow, sickening clarity, the kind that tightens around the chest and refuses to loosen. What had been hidden for decades was not dramatic in appearance. It didn't look like a smoking gun. It looked like inevitability. When the final pieces aligned, the first response wasn't celebration. It was disbelief. The FBI had been careful not to frame expectations, even internally. But as independent findings began to converge, it became harder to deny that the disappearance was no longer just unexplained. It was understood. Not fully, not in every detail, but enough to change the story forever. The night in 1993 had not been random. It had not been a tragic accident of timing. It had followed a logic that only became visible when viewed from a distance of 30 years. The overlooked detail from the past became the anchor point. When cross-referenced with newly accessible records and behavioral analysis, it revealed proximity that had never been acknowledged. Someone who should have been peripheral suddenly appeared central. Someone whose presence had been normalized at the time now stood out sharply against the reconstructed timeline, not because they had done something obvious, but because of what they hadn't done. Absence, it turned out, wasn't limited to the missing person. There were gaps in actions. Moments when intervention would have been expected, opportunities where concern should have been expressed, but wasn't. These weren't things that registered as alarming in 1993. Context mattered. Familiarity mattered. Trust mattered. But in hindsight, those silences spoke louder than any witness statement ever had. The FBI's analysis revealed a narrow window of time, smaller than anyone had previously believed. The disappearance had not occurred sometime during the party or sometime after. It had occurred within minutes. The timeline collapsed inward, tightening around a sequence of events that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The night suddenly felt claustrophobic, its possibilities sharply limited. One discovery in particular forced investigators to stop and reassess everything they thought they knew. A record, buried, unremarkable on its own, placed someone exactly where they had claimed not to be. Not long, not far, just enough to matter. It wasn't proof in isolation, but it fit too cleanly with everything else to ignore. That was when the weight of it settled in. The realization that the truth had been close all along was devastating, not just because it suggested what might have been missed, but because it reframed the suffering that followed. The years of searching, the nights of waiting, the hope that flickered and died over and over again. All of it now existed alongside the knowledge that the answer had not been unreachable. It had been standing in plain sight, camouflaged by assumption. As investigators continued, they uncovered behavior after the disappearance that had once seemed benign. Small decisions that, at the time, were chalked up to stress or confusion. Now, viewed through the lens of intent, those same decisions felt calculated. Delays that benefited no one except the person making them. Information shared selectively. Memory that sharpened in some areas while blurring in others. There was no confession waiting at the end of this trail. No dramatic admission. What emerged instead was something colder and more unsettling. A narrative built entirely from choices. From what was done. From what wasn't. From how the night was navigated by someone who understood exactly how invisible they could remain. When the FBI presented their findings internally, the room reportedly went quiet. Not because the evidence was weak, but because of how strong it felt without ever crossing into spectacle. This wasn't a story of violence that announced itself. It was a story of opportunity, familiarity, and silence. A story that relied on the assumption that no one would ever look this closely again. For the family, the revelation arrived carefully. Investigators understood that truth delivered carelessly can wound just as deeply as lies. They explained what had been found, how it fit together, what it meant, and what it could not yet prove beyond question. There were no guarantees offered, no promises of neat resolution, just honesty. The reaction was complex. There was relief, sharp and unexpected, at finally being seen, at knowing the story had not been forgotten or dismissed. There was anger, white-hot and long overdue, at the idea that the truth had been delayed not by fate, but by human error and human deception. And there was grief, renewed and intensified, for the years lost to uncertainty. Shock did not come from learning what likely happened. It came from understanding how easily it had been hidden. The discovery sent quiet tremors through those connected to the case. People who had once been confident in their understanding of a night found themselves questioning their memories. After the discovery settled into public consciousness, the story refused to end cleanly. There was no collective exhale, no sense of relief that usually follows answers. Instead, the revelation opened a deeper, more uncomfortable space, one filled with questions that could not be easily contained or resolved. Understanding what likely happened only sharpened the edges of everything that came before it. The most haunting question was not who was responsible, but how close everyone had been without knowing it. People returned to the early days of the case with new eyes, replaying familiar scenes, as if watching an old film with an altered ending. The birthday party no longer felt like the beginning of a mystery, but the final moment before truth slipped past unnoticed. Every assumption made that night now carried weight. Every dismissal felt heavier. The idea that certainty had been built on trust rather than verification unsettled people in ways they hadn't anticipated. Investigators faced their own reckoning. The findings did not point to a single failure or a single mistake, but to a series of human decisions shaped by context, limitation, and belief. In 1993, investigators had worked with what they had, but in hindsight, it became clear how much early momentum had depended on the assumption that danger comes from the outside, not from within familiar spaces. That assumption had quietly guided priorities, narrowed focus, and influenced what was deemed worth pursuing. This wasn't a story of negligence so much as it was a story of blind spots. The discovery forced law enforcement agencies to examine how familiarity can dull suspicion, how community trust can inadvertently shield wrongdoing, and how early narratives, once formed, resist correction even when cracks begin to show. These realizations were not easy to face, especially for those who had dedicated their careers to preventing exactly this kind of outcome. For the family, the reckoning was more personal, more visceral. Knowing the likely truth did not bring peace. It brought clarity, and clarity came with its own form of pain. Every year of waiting now carried an added layer of meaning. They wondered how many times they had been close to answers without realizing it, how many conversations they had replayed without knowing which ones mattered most, how many moments of hope had been built on foundations that were already compromised. Anger surfaced in waves, unpredictable and intense. Anger at the person whose choices had shaped the night. Anger at a system that had taken decades to see what was now undeniable. Anger at time itself, for moving forward without permission. But anger did not dominate completely. It shared space with exhaustion, grief, and unfamiliar sense of vindication. The truth had not disappeared. It had waited. Public reaction evolved as the initial shock faded. Conversations shifted from disbelief to reflection. People began asking broader questions, uncomfortable ones that resisted easy answers. How many cases had followed a similar pattern, stalled not by lack of evidence, but by misplaced certainty? How often had trust been mistaken for safety? How many truths remained buried simply because no one thought to look again? The story became less about one disappearance and more about the nature of knowing. It challenged the belief that time inevitably leads to resolution. In this case, time had obscured rather than clarified, layering assumption over fact until the original shape of the truth was nearly unrecognizable. Media coverage reflected this shift. The tone grew quieter, more contemplative. Instead of focusing on sensational elements, reports lingered on the implications. Experts weighed in on investigative bias. Former detectives spoke candidly about cases that haunted them for similar reasons. Families of other missing persons watched closely, seeing both hope and warning in what had unfolded. The question that could not be unasked lingered at the center of every conversation. What if someone had looked differently back then? It wasn't an accusation aimed at a single person or decision. It was a collective unease, a recognition that truth is fragile, easily shaped by context and expectation. Once that recognition takes hold, it becomes impossible to return to simpler explanations. For the town, the reckoning was subtle but profound. The disappearance had already altered its identity years ago. Now, the discovery reopened old wounds and introduced new ones. People revisited their own memories of that time, questioned what they had noticed, what they had ignored. Trust, once fractured, was now examined under a harsher light. Familiar faces carried new shadows, even if no wrongdoing could be attached to them. There was also guilt, quiet and unresolved. Guilt for moving on when the family could not. Guilt for assuming the story would never change. Guilt for accepting uncertainty as inevitable. These feelings didn't manifest in dramatic ways. They surfaced in pauses, in careful phrasing, in the way people spoke about the case with a mix of respect and restraint. Investigators faced a different kind of accountability. While the discovery validated the renewed effort, it also highlighted the cost of delay. Policies were revisited. Training emphasized the dangers of early narrative lock-in. Cold case units gained renewed attention, not as symbolic gestures, but as necessary correctives to institutional memory. Yet, even as accountability discussions unfolded, one truth remained unavoidable. No amount of reflection could undo the night in 1993. No policy change could restore what had been taken. The reckoning, for all its importance, existed alongside an unchangeable past. For the family, closure remained an elusive concept. Knowing more did not mean knowing everything. Understanding intent did not answer every question. There were still gaps, still moments that resisted explanation. Closure, they realized, was not a destination, but a process, one that unfolds unevenly and without guarantees. They spoke openly about this complexity, resisting narratives that framed the discovery as an ending. It was a milestone, not a conclusion. In the aftermath, the word closure hovered over everything like a promise no one quite believed anymore. It appeared in interviews, in official statements, in well-intentioned conversations that tried to offer comfort. But for those who lived inside the story for decades, closure was not something that arrived neatly once answers emerged. It was not a door that closed. It was not a chapter that ended. It was something quieter, more complicated, and far less satisfying than people imagined. The family learned this almost immediately when the discovery became public. There was a brief moment when the world seemed to expect relief, as if knowing more should somehow make the weight lighter. But the weight did not lift. It shifted. It changed shape. The absence that had defined their lives for so long did not disappear just because it was finally understood. If anything, it became sharper, more defined, more real. There was comfort in truth, but it was a restrained comfort, one that did not erase grief. Knowing what likely happened did not return lost years or soften memories that had already hardened with time. It did not undo birthdays spent waiting, or holidays filled with empty chairs, or the countless moments when hope had risen only to fall again. Truth offered clarity, not restoration. For the family, closure came not as peace, but as permission. Permission to stop imagining endless possibilities. Permission to let go of some questions while accepting that others would never be answered. Permission to grieve without the constant interruption of what-ifs. It was not the end they would have chosen, but it was an ending of sorts, one that allowed them to breathe differently, even if breathing still hurt. They returned, often privately, to the memory of that birthday night, not to relive the fear, but to reclaim the moments before everything changed. The laughter, the warmth, the ordinary joy that had been overshadowed by what followed. In doing so, they resisted letting the disappearance define the entirety of that memory. The night had taken enough. It did not need to take the happiness that came before it. The town, too, found itself searching for a new relationship with the story. For years, the disappearance had been a quiet wound, something acknowledged but rarely confronted directly. Now, with the truth closer to the surface, people spoke about it differently. Less speculation, less rumor, more reflection, more humility. There was a collective recognition that the town had not failed intentionally, but had failed in ways that mattered. That recognition did not lead to blame so much as it led to restraint. People listened more carefully. They questioned assumptions more readily. They understood, in a way they hadn't before, that safety is not guaranteed by familiarity. Life continued, because it always does. Streets filled again. New families moved in. Children grew up without ever knowing the story firsthand. But the disappearance left a permanent imprint, a subtle awareness that lingered beneath everyday routines, a reminder that some moments fracture time in ways that can never be fully repaired. Nationally, the case settled into a different kind of legacy. It was no longer just a mystery. It became a lesson, a cautionary example cited in discussions about cold cases, investigative bias, and the dangers of certainty. It reminded people that truth does not always surface quickly, and that silence should never be mistaken for emptiness. For others still waiting on answers in their own unresolved cases, the story offered a complex mix of hope and warning. Hope that time and persistence could still matter. Warning that answers, when they arrive, may not bring the peace people imagine. Still, the possibility of knowing remained powerful. Even imperfect truth felt preferable to endless uncertainty. As the years moved forward, the family learned how to live with what remained. Not just grief, but memory. Not just loss, but love. They spoke the name often, not as an invocation of tragedy, but as an affirmation of existence. To be remembered was to still be present in some way. To be spoken of was to resist erasure. In quiet moments, the story returned to its beginning, to a house filled with balloons and music, to a cake waiting to be cut, to a night that was supposed to pass gently into memory. That image never changed, even as everything else did. It stood in contrast to the decades that followed, a reminder how quickly ordinary life can tip into something unrecognizable. There was no triumphant ending to offer, no final image of justice neatly served. The story concluded instead with something softer and more haunting, acceptance without resolution, understanding without peace. The knowledge that some truths arrived too late to heal, but too important to ignore. Closure, in the end, was not about forgetting or moving on. It was about carrying the story differently, with honesty instead of speculation, with memory instead of mystery, with grief that had a shape, even if it never fully faded. The birthday in 1993 remained a dividing line, a moment frozen in time. But it was no longer the only thing the story was about. It had become part of something larger, something that spoke to fragility of certainty and the endurance of truth. And so the story rested, not resolved, but understood, not finished, but finally heard. A reminder that even when answers come decades later, they still matter. And that some nights never truly end. They simply change the way we remember them.